As you conceptualize a system, it's important to be thinking into the future on how requirements might vary over time and how the resources you're offered for meeting requirements could actually be very, very limited in the short term. So if you look at any given baseline functionality that might have been implemented in the system, whether that's a system you've recently implemented or simply the way the organization does things today. But if you're embarking into a new area trying to conceptualize a system expansion or a system implementation, you always start from the baseline of where the functional implementation is today. So say you've got some baseline going into the future. The challenge is that whatever requirements you define will not stay static going into the future as you go through. So you need to plan for the future because requirements are actually going to emerge and continue to evolve over time. You'll get more and more requirements for whatever system you implement over time. There will always be a gap between the system as you've implemented it or as you've defined it and what the total set of requirements are. Some of those requirements might be things you don't recognize as requirements till after you implement the system, or they're requirements that were not feasible or possible in some of the evolution models the day you implemented the system, but you're hoping to get to them in the future. So whatever the reason, you've always got a gap between the requirements that have actually been identified for your system and the baseline you've actually implemented. So you're actually running a race between those two as you go through. You will create and enhance your systems over time to incrementally add more and more and more over time. Often that's because the requirements weren't known, but even more often it's because for each system's implementation you do, you only have a limited number of resources. So you're constantly implementing within those resources the highest priority or the near-term requirements, but always leaving something into the future that you'll go with a new implementation over time. That becomes a long-term strategy for monitoring your system, where if you really look at it in the long haul, you're constantly chasing that curve of increasing requirements with small minor tweaks to your system functionality over time, sometimes a major release establishing a new baseline that might even exceed requirements for some period of time, and then more incremental change over time. So notice in this diagram, each major release captures all of the known requirements at that point in time, maybe even going a little beyond them and exceeding expectations, but very quickly over time finding that it doesn't meet the requirements over time. So whenever you're trying to conceptualize a system, try to think out not just the system you're building for today, but where those requirements might be in the future, because many of the requirements that you will define will probably not get into your system on day one. There'll be things you'll defer or wait for in the future. So think of your requirements as an evolving set of needs for your stakeholders going well out into the future that you as an engineering team will have to constantly be modifying and expanding your system to be able to capture. You don't want the requirements to get too far out in front of where your system is, but you're also not going to react to every new requirement over time. So if you plan on a 5-year or 3-year or even a 1-year cycle of constantly upgrading and expanding the capabilities of your system, you'll have a much more realistic approach to defining requirements. The challenge is, for whatever those requirements are going into the future, write down as many of them as you can on day one and try to conceptualize your system as it will exist in the future, not as it will exist today.